A single book, 20 accusations of heresy, and the intellectual fate of an entire civilization hanging in the balance. In 1095, Imam al-Ghazali wrote a text so devastating that it would be called the dagger that stabbed philosophy in such a manner that it could not rise again in the Muslim world. He declared some of the greatest minds in Islamic history, philosophers like Avicenna and al-Farabi, not just wrong but unbelievers, apostates, enemies of Islam itself. For 70 years silence. No one dared answer. Then, in the fading light of Islamic Spain, a judge named Ibn Rushd picked up his pen. His mission, to prove that Al-Ghazali, the man called Proof of Islam, was profoundly, dangerously wrong. This is the story of two men, two books, and the question that would split the Islamic world. Can reason coexist with faith, or must one destroy the other? To understand this battle, we need to go back to Baghdad in the late 11th century, the intellectual heart of the Islamic world. By 1091, Falsafa, Islamic philosophy, had reached its zenith. Philosophers like Ibn Sina had created sophisticated systems integrating Aristotle's logic with Islamic theology. They spoke of eternal worlds, necessary causation, and a God who knew universals, but perhaps not particulars. They believed reason could unlock the deepest truths of existence. Into this world stepped Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Born in 1058 in Tus, Persia, al-Ghazali was no ordinary scholar. By age 33, he held the most prestigious academic position in the Islamic world, professor at the Nizamiya College in Baghdad, appointed by the powerful vizier Nizam al-Mulk himself. But al-Ghazali had a problem. He'd mastered philosophy, spent years studying it, and he saw something the masses didn't. These philosophers, for all their brilliance, were teaching doctrines that contradicted Islam at its core. So between 1091 and 1095, Al-Ghazali wrote 4 interconnected works. The first, Aims of the Philosophers, summarized Avicenna's philosophy with such clarity that some mistook it for endorsement. The second was his true weapon, Tahafut al-Falasifa, the Incoherence of the Philosophers, 20 chapters, 20 devastating refutations. And in 3 of those chapters, Al-Ghazali went for the throat. He declared that anyone who believed these 3 doctrines wasn't just mistaken. They were kafirs, unbelievers, outside the fold of Islam. The book was an earthquake. Al-Ghazali then abandoned his prestigious position, underwent a spiritual crisis, and wandered for over a decade, turning to Sufism, to mysticism, to a direct experience of God that philosophy could never provide. When he returned to teaching shortly before his death in 1111, his victory seemed complete. Philosophy in the Islamic East? Crippled. The rationalist project? In retreat. Al-Ghazali had won. Or had he? Let's be clear about what Al-Ghazali was actually arguing. This is crucial because he's often misunderstood, even today. Al-Ghazali did not reject all philosophy. He explicitly stated, "I have no dispute with mathematics, logic, physics, or astronomy. These sciences are demonstrable and useful." What he attacked was metaphysics, the philosopher's attempts to use pure reason to understand law, creation, and ultimate reality. His method was surgical. In Aims of the Philosophers, he demonstrated he could explain Avicenna's system better than most of Avicenna's own students. Only then, in the Tahafut, did he dismantle it piece by piece. The 20 problems broke down like this. 17 problems. Bid'ah, heretical innovation. Serious, but correctable. 3 problems. Kufr, disbelief. Unforgivable. These were occasion, Problem 1. The eternity of the world. The philosophers argued the world has existed eternally alongside God. Why? Because God is eternal and unchanging. His will is eternal. His power is eternal. So how could he suddenly decide to create the world at a particular moment? What changed? What could cause an eternal, perfect being to act when he hadn't before? Al-Ghazali's response was elegant and devastating. He said, "You're applying human logic to God. You're trapped thinking God's will works like ours, that he needs a reason, a motive, a change of mind. But God's will is utterly unlike human will. He can choose to create at one moment rather than another simply because he wills it. No external cause needed." He went further. If the world were eternal, you'd have to accept that an infinite amount of time has passed. But that's logically absurd. Infinity, by definition, cannot be traversed. You can't cross an infinite distance to arrive at the present moment. Therefore, the world must have a beginning in time. But Al-Ghazali had an even deeper concern. If the world is eternal and necessarily flows from God's nature, like light flows from the sun, then God didn't choose to create. He had no option. Creation wasn't an act of will, but a necessity of his being. And that, Al-Ghazali argued, strips God of his most essential attribute, free will. It makes him a prisoner of his own nature. It makes him something less than a true agent. The Quran is clear. He says, "Be, and it is." Creation is an act of divine command, divine choice. To deny this is to deny the God of Abraham, Moses, and Muhammad. Problem 2, God's knowledge. The philosophers, especially Avicenna, taught that God knows universals but not particulars. God understands the concept of humanity, but not you specifically. He grasps the nature of events, but not that you stubbed your toe this morning. Why did they believe this? Because they thought knowledge of particulars would require God to change. As new events happen, God would need to acquire new knowledge. But God is eternal and unchanging. He can't have new knowledge. Therefore, he must know only timeless, universal truths. Al-Ghazali found this obscene. "Are you telling me," he asked, "that God knows there are stars but not how many? That he knows humans exist but not you personally? That he knows prayers occur but doesn't hear your prayer?" This isn't just bad theology, it's spiritually devastating. If God doesn't know you as an individual, how can you have a relationship with him? How can he answer your prayers? How can divine providence exist? How can the entire edifice of Islam, a religion of personal accountability before God, make any sense? The philosophers had tried to preserve God's transcendence and ended up with a God so distant, so abstract, that he might as well not exist. They'd created, Al-Ghazali said, a dead God, one who doesn't truly know or care about his creation. Problem 3, bodily resurrection. The philosophers taught that only souls survive death. The body decays. The material world is inferior. Resurrection is spiritual, not physical. But Al-Ghazali pointed out, the Quran explicitly describes bodily resurrection, the pleasures of paradise, the torments of hell. You can't just allegorize these away because they seem philosophically problematic. This wasn't about defending literal interpretations for their own sake. It was about recognizing limits. If philosophers can reinterpret clear Quranic verses whenever they contradict Aristotle, then nothing in Revelation is safe. Scripture becomes putty in the hands of intellectuals. The philosophers' arrogance, their assumption that reason trumps revelation, would gut Islam from within. While the deeper issue, causality. But Al-Ghazali's most radical move came in Problem 17. His attack on causation itself. The philosophers believed in necessary causal connections. Fire burns cotton. Always, necessarily. Why? Because fire has a nature, an essence that makes it burn. Cotton has a nature that makes it flammable. When they meet, combustion must occur. Al-Ghazali said, no. You observe fire touching cotton, then combustion. You observe this repeatedly, so you assume causation. But observation only shows concomitance, things happening together, not causation. You never see the causal power itself. His famous example, when fire and cotton meet, we don't see fire burning cotton. We see two events, contact and combustion, occurring together. God creates both events simultaneously. God is the only true cause. Fire doesn't burn. God creates burning when fire touches cotton. This is occasionalism, the view that deed is the direct, immediate cause of every event. There are no natural causes, no inherent powers in things. The universe runs on divine command, moment by moment. Why did Al-Ghazali argue this? Two reasons. First, to make room for miracles. If fire must burn cotton by nature, how can Moses' staff become a serpent? How can Jesus raise the dead? The philosophers had created a world so bound by natural law that God himself couldn't break the rules. Occasionalism restored divine omnipotence. Second, to humble philosophy. If causation is just habitual divine action, not logical necessity, then philosophers can't deduce the structure of reality from first principles. They need revelation. They need humility. Al-Ghazali wasn't anti-reason. He was anti-arrogance. He was fighting the idea that reason alone, without revelation, could unlock ultimate truth. He was defending the primacy of faith. And for 70 years after his death in 1111, it seemed he'd won. Now we shift across the Mediterranean to Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, in the mid-12th century. Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, was born in Cordoba on April 14, 1126, 15 years after Al-Ghazali's death. Into a family of distinguished judges, his grandfather had been chief Qadi of Cordoba under the Almoravids. His father held the same position. This matters. Ibn Rushd wasn't some renegade intellectual. He was the establishment, a judge, a physician, a man deeply embedded in Islamic law and tradition. When he defended philosophy, he wasn't some outsider attacking Islam. He was an insider claiming that philosophy is Islamic, properly understood. Ibn Rushd's education was comprehensive. Quranic studies, hadith, Maliki jurisprudence, medicine, astronomy, and crucially, philosophy. He studied the works of Ibn Bajjah and was introduced to the Almohad Caliph Abu Yaqub Yusuf in 1169 by the philosopher Ibn Tufayl. That meeting changed history. The Caliph asked Ibn Rushd a dangerous question. Did the heavens exist eternally, or did they have a beginning? Ibn Rushd, terrified of giving the wrong answer, stayed silent. But the Caliph and Ibn Tufayl then discussed Plato, Aristotle, and Islamic philosophers with such sophistication that Ibn Rushd realized, this is a ruler who values intellectual honesty. The Caliph then commissioned Ibn Rushd to do something extraordinary, write comprehensive commentaries on Aristotle's works, making Greek philosophy accessible to the Islamic world. Ibn Rushd produced three types of commentaries: short summaries, middle commentaries, and detailed long commentaries. He commented on nearly all of Aristotle: logic, physics, metaphysics, psychology, ethics. In doing this work, Ibn Rushd came face to face with Al-Ghazali's Tahafut, and he was appalled, not just by the conclusions, but by the method. Al-Ghazali had attacked philosophy using distorted versions of philosophical arguments. He'd attributed views to the philosophers that were actually Avicenna's innovations, not Aristotle's original positions. So around 1180, Ibn Rushd wrote his masterpiece, Tahafut al-Tahafut, The Incoherence of the Incoherence. The title itself was a mic drop. Al-Ghazali thought he'd expose philosophy's incoherence. Ibn Rushd would expose the incoherence of Al-Ghazali's critique. The book's format was brilliant. Ibn Rushd quoted Al-Ghazali's arguments line by line, then systematically demolished them. It reads like a courtroom drama. The prosecution's case presented, then the defense's rebuttal. Philosophy on trial with Ibn Rushd as its attorney. Let's see how he responded to Al-Ghazali's 3 accusations of kufr. Defense of the eternal world. Ibn Rushd began by clarifying what eternal actually means to philosophers. They weren't saying the world existed as a separate entity alongside God. They meant God's act of creation is eternal. God's creative activity has no beginning or end. Think of it this way, Ibn Rushd argued. God is the eternal cause. The world is the eternal effect. Just as light eternally proceeds from the sun's nature, the world eternally proceeds from God's creative power. This doesn't make the world independent of God. It makes it eternally dependent on Him. He tackled Al-Ghazali's argument about divine will. You say God chooses to create at a particular moment, but choice implies indecision, deliberation, weighing options. That's human will, which is weak and changeable. God's will is perfect and unchanging. He doesn't decide like we do. He eternally wills what is best. To the objection about traversing infinity, you're confusing different types of infinity. The world has no temporal beginning, but that doesn't mean you're traversing an actual infinite. Each moment is finite. The infinity is potential. There's always a moment before, but never an actual infinite number you're counting through. But Ibn Rushd's deepest point was about the Quran itself. Show me one verse that clearly states the world was created in time, ex nihilo. The Quran says, His throne was upon the waters before creation, implying something existed. It says, God created the heavens and earth in 6 days, but from what? From pre-existing matter. The Quran doesn't specify. Al-Ghazali had claimed consensus, ijma, among scholars that the world was created in time. Ibn Rushd responded, there is no such consensus on this metaphysical issue. It's a matter where allegorical interpretation is permissible for those qualified to engage in it. Defense of divine knowledge. Here Ibn Rushd got more technical. He argued that Al-Ghazali had misunderstood the philosopher's position. They weren't saying God is ignorant of particulars. They were saying God's knowledge is qualitatively different from ours. God knows particulars, but not in the way we know them. We know particulars through change. I learn of events as they happen. But God's knowledge is eternal and unchanging. He knows all particulars in their universal aspect. He knows them timelessly, completely, all at once. Think of it like this. You read a book, page by page, discovering the story as you go. The author knows the whole story simultaneously. God's knowledge is like the author's, complete, immediate, eternal. He doesn't acquire knowledge as events unfold. He knows them in their totality. Ibn Rushd pushed back. What's more impious, to say God knows particulars in a perfect, eternal way that transcends human understanding, or to say God's knowledge changes, updates, acquires new information like ours does? That would make God temporal, mutable, imperfect. Defense against the bodily resurrection charge. Ibn Rushd was more careful here. He argued that the philosophers' position was more nuanced than Al-Ghazali claimed. They believed in resurrection, they just understood it differently. The masses need literal descriptions, paradise with gardens and rivers, hell with fire and torment. Fine, that's how the Quran speaks to them, in language they understand. But philosophers who grasp deeper truths can recognize these as metaphorical descriptions of spiritual realities. He quoted the Quran, "There is nothing like unto him." If God is beyond all comparison, why can't the afterlife also transcend our bodily understanding? The philosophers weren't denying afterlife rewards and punishments. They were saying the reality is more profound than literal physical pleasure and pain. But Ibn Rushd's crucial legal argument, for someone to be declared a kafir, there must be clear consensus on the matter, and the person must be told. Their interpretation is forbidden. There's no consensus on these metaphysical issues. These are matters of interpretation, not clear-cut apostasy. But the most dramatic confrontation came over causation, because here, Ibn Rushd didn't just disagree with Al-Ghazali. He thought Al-Ghazali's position was philosophically absurd and religiously dangerous. The causality debate. Ibn Rushd read Al-Ghazali's occasionalism, the view that God directly causes every event, and he was horrified. Not because it was pious, because it destroyed the possibility of knowledge. If there are no natural causes, Ibn Rushd argued, then there's no such thing as science. Medicine would be impossible. You couldn't say this herb cures this disease, because the herb doesn't actually cause healing. God does, arbitrarily. Engineering would be impossible. You couldn't say this design will hold weight, because the design doesn't actually support weight. God holds things up moment by moment. He pressed harder. Al-Ghazali says we only observe concomitance, not causation. Fire touches cotton, combustion happens. We assume a connection, but we don't see the causal power. Fine, but then apply that skepticism consistently. How do you know God exists? You observe order in the universe and infer a cause, but by your own logic you only observe concomitance. You don't see God's causal power any more than you see fires. This was devastating. Al-Ghazali had used skepticism about natural causation to defend divine omnipotence. Ibn Rushd showed that same skepticism, applied consistently, would destroy our knowledge of God himself. Ibn Rushd had another argument, equally powerful. You say God creates combustion directly when fire touches cotton. God could, if he wished, make fire freeze cotton instead. Nothing in fire's nature necessitates burning. But tell me, do you really believe this? If you saw fire approaching cotton, would you not pull the cotton away? If you touched fire, would you not fear being burned? Your actions reveal that you do believe in natural causation. You deny with your tongue what is present in your mind. He continued, God gave things natures. Fire has the nature of burning. Cotton has the nature of being flammable. These natures are real, God-given powers. When fire burns cotton, God is the ultimate cause. He created fire with that nature, but fire is the proximate cause. This doesn't limit God's power. It manifests his wisdom in creating an orderly, intelligible world. For miracles, Ibn Rushd had a response. God can intervene in his creation. He's the ultimate power, but exceptions don't disprove rules. Miracles are rare, deliberate divine interventions, not the norm. Al-Ghazali's occasionalism makes everything a miracle, which means nothing is. the deeper philosophical issue, reason versus revelation. But beneath these specific debates lay a fundamental question. What's the relationship between reason and revelation? Between philosophy and religion? Al-Ghazali's position, reason is useful but limited. In metaphysical matters, God's nature, creation, the afterlife, revelation trumps reason. When philosophy contradicts clear religious truths, philosophy must yield. Faith first. Ibn Rushd's position, truth is one. God gave us reason. God gave us revelation. They can't truly contradict because they both come from God. Apparent contradictions arise from misunderstanding one or both. His key move, distinguishing three types of people. First, the masses, most people. They understand religion through literal readings, stories, metaphors. They don't need philosophy. The Quran speaks to them in clear, accessible language. Second, theologians, the middle group. They use dialectical arguments, theology, kalam, moderate reasoning. They defend faith, engage doubts, but don't reach the deepest truths. Third, philosophers, the elite few with the intellectual training to grasp demonstrative, rigorous proofs. They can read the Quran allegorically when necessary, understanding deeper meanings. The Quran itself, Ibn Rushd argued, says it contains both clear verses and ambiguous verses. Those firm in knowledge can interpret the ambiguous ones. Philosophy is that firm knowledge. It's not alien to Islam. It's the highest form of Islamic intellectual engagement. He wrote a short treatise, decisive treatise on the harmony of religion and philosophy, where he argued, the Quran commands philosophical investigation when it says reflect on creation, use reason, ponder the signs. These are divine injunctions to do philosophy. I stated the question of interpretation. But Ibn Rushd added a crucial caveat. Philosophers shouldn't share their allegorical interpretations with the masses. Why? Not because the masses are stupid, but because it could confuse them, undermine their simple faith, cause fitna, discord. He was pragmatic about this. The literal understanding works for most people. They don't need to grapple with eternal worlds or immaterial intellects. Let them have their straightforward faith. But don't condemn the philosophers who understand more deeply. Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd argued, had violated this principle. By publicly attacking the philosophers and declaring them kuffar, he'd created confusion. He'd made people suspicious of reason itself. He'd discouraged intellectual inquiry. And ironically, this would harm Islam more than the philosophers ever could. The tragedy of Ibn Rushd. Because here's the cruel irony. Ibn Rushd was right about the danger, but he lost. Despite his brilliance, despite the cogency of his arguments, despite his deep Islamic credentials, Ibn Rushd's philosophy was rejected in the Islamic world. In 1195, the Almohad Caliph al-Mansur, facing political pressure from conservative factions, formally condemned philosophy. Ibn Rushd was exiled to Lucena, a small Jewish village near Cordoba. His books were burned, his life's work repudiated. He was eventually allowed back to court, but died shortly after, on December 10, 1198, in Marrakesh. He was 72 years old. His body was initially buried in Morocco, then moved to Cordoba for a second funeral, where the young Ibn Arabi, future Sufi master, was present and later described the scene poignantly. Ibn Rushd's works survived, but not in the Islamic world. They were translated into Hebrew by Jewish scholars, into Latin by Christian scholars. His commentaries on Aristotle became foundational texts at the University of Paris. Thomas Aquinas engaged with the commentator Averroes extensively. Ibn Rushd shaped European scholasticism, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution. But in the Islamic world, his voice faded. Al-Ghazali's critique stood. Philosophy retreated to the margins. So, who won this debate? The easy answer, Al-Ghazali won in the Islamic world. His critique of philosophy succeeded. After him, Falsafa never regained its golden age prominence in the Islamic East. Scholars focused on law, theology, Sufism, but not speculative philosophy. Some modern commentators blame Al-Ghazali for the decline of Islamic science. Neil deGrasse Tyson, Steven Weinberg, others have argued, Al-Ghazali's attack on causation and reason stifled scientific inquiry. His occasionalism made systematic science impossible. But here's where the story gets complicated. This narrative is too simple. Recent scholarship by historians like George Saliba, Frank Griffel, and others has shown science didn't die after Al-Ghazali. Islamic astronomy flourished in the 13th and 14th centuries. Ibn al-Nafis discovered pulmonary circulation. Al-Tusi, al-Shirazi, Ibn al-Shatir made groundbreaking astronomical observations and models. Mathematics continued. Medicine continued. These scholars read Al-Ghazali, some were Sufis, but still did science. The decline, when it came, had more complex causes. The Mongol invasions devastated the Islamic East in 1258. The Black Death in the 14th century. Political fragmentation. Economic shifts. Changing educational priorities in madrasas that emphasize law over natural sciences. It wasn't one book or one man. Moreover, Al-Ghazali explicitly said, I have no problem with mathematics, physics, astronomy, or medicine. These are demonstrable sciences. My quarrel is with metaphysics. He wasn't anti-science. He was anti-speculative philosophy that contradicts Islam. But, and here's the crucial point, Ibn Rushd was right about something deeper. Al-Ghazali's critique did create a culture of intellectual caution. It did make philosophers defensive. It did elevate revelation over reason as the ultimate authority in all matters, not just theological ones. The irony? Al-Ghazali's own method was philosophical. His arguments in the Tahafut used logic, dialectic, analysis. He was a brilliant philosopher critiquing philosophy. The tool he used to attack reason was reason itself. Ibn Rushd saw this contradiction. He argued, you can't condemn philosophy while doing philosophy. You can't say reason is unreliable while using reason to argue that revelation is reliable. The deeper legacy. But here's what's often missed. Both men were trying to save Islam. Both were responding to real concerns. Al-Ghazali saw philosophers drifting from Quranic teaching, becoming intellectual elitists, creating a parallel religious system based on Greek metaphysics rather than revealed truth. He fought to recenter Islam on faith, devotion, and divine transcendence. Ibn Rushd saw theology stifling intellectual curiosity, making Muslims suspicious of reason, creating a faith that couldn't engage with the deepest questions. He fought to show that Islam encourages, demands, rational investigation as a form of worship. They were both right about dangers. They were both wrong to think their approach was the only way. Modern Muslim scholars are still grappling with this debate. Some side with Al-Ghazali, preserve orthodoxy, prioritize tradition, be cautious about rationalism. Others side with Ibn Rushd, embrace critical thinking, engage philosophy, integrate modern knowledge. The debate isn't settled. It can't be settled because it's asking, what's the relationship between human reason and divine revelation? That question doesn't have a single answer that works for all times. all contexts. The final irony. But here's the final bitter irony. Ibn Rushd's works influenced Western Christianity and Judaism more than Islam. His defense of reason helped spark the European Renaissance. His harmonization of faith in reason influenced Christian scholasticism. Jewish philosophers like Maimonides engaged deeply with his work. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, his books were lost. Many survive only in Latin or Hebrew translations. The Arabic originals? Gone. It's as if Ibn Rushd built a magnificent library and it burned in his homeland but was rebuilt abroad. The irony is almost unbearable. The man who argued for philosophy as Islamic intellectual practice became the Muslim philosopher most influential on non-Muslims. Al-Ghazali wanted to save Islam from philosophy. Ibn Rushd wanted to save philosophy for Islam. In the Islamic world, Al-Ghazali succeeded. In the wider world, Ibn Rushd succeeded. Both won, both lost. Reflection. What can we learn from this? First, be careful with purges. Al-Ghazali's attack was so total, so devastating, that it created a chilling effect. Brilliant minds thought twice before engaging philosophical questions. Intellectual vibrancy declined, not because of one book, but because of the culture it helped create. Second, reason and faith need each other. Al-Ghazali was right that reason alone can't reach ultimate truth. Ibn Rushd was right that faith without reason becomes blind. The best path integrates both, humble about reason's limits, but willing to use it fully. Third, context matters. Al-Ghazali wrote in Baghdad, the political center, where philosophy threatened religious authority. Ibn Rushd wrote in Al-Andalus, a multicultural frontier where Christians, Jews, and Muslims exchanged ideas. Different contexts, different answers. Fourth, we're still having this debate. In every religious tradition, you find this tension. How much should tradition bend to new knowledge? How much should new knowledge respect tradition? The Al-Ghazali/Ibn Rushd debate is the medieval Islamic version of a timeless question. The debate that changed Islamic history? Yes. But also the debate that reveals something timeless about the human quest for truth, the eternal tension between faith and reason, authority and inquiry, tradition and innovation. Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd are both dead, but their arguments still very much alive, still shaping how we think about knowledge, belief, and the possibility of wisdom. And that, more than any victory in their own time, is their true legacy.